Welcome to our webinar on qualitative interviewing. I'm Grace Brown, a research specialist at Holt.
And I'm Katarzyna Bachnik, a professor of marketing and innovation at Holt. Together with Grace, we prepared the following plan for our webinar.
So this webinar is designed as an introduction to qualitative interviewing. It will initially describe what an interview is and when and why you might use one, and then we'll talk you through what you might need to prepare prior to the interview, and then give you some general rules to stick to when conducting the interview. And after that, we'll give you some useful tips that we've both learned from our experience, and we'll provide you with some useful references at the end. So let's move on to firstly, what are qualitative interviews?
To put it simply, it's a method of collecting qualitative data from participants about a topic of your research interest. When designing interview, you need to think of the preferred structure, capacity, and style. We can decide to go for structured, semi-structured, or unstructured interviews. When it comes to structured interviews, they are usually based on a questionnaire with a sequence of questions that you ask in the same order and the same way of all subjects of the research. The main objective here is to obtain comparable information from a potentially large number of subjects so that you can use statistical methods of analysis. If you prefer more flexibility as moderator and facilitator, you will probably go for semi-structured and unstructured interviews. They share three core features. Firstly, there is interaction between interviewer and interviewee. Both sides co-created. Such an exchange of a dialogue usually happens in a face-to-face context, so you can really pay attention to your respondent. Secondly, even though the researcher has some themes they wish to cover, they do it within a fluid and flexible structure. You'll decide literally during the interview how and when the questions are put and how the interviewee can respond. And thirdly, it's up to you as the researcher to ensure that relevant contexts are brought into focus so that you produce a particular knowledge that is embedded in the overall goal of the interview and your research. Generally speaking, semi-structured and unstructured interviews differ with the idea how much space you allow your interviewee to answer on their own terms, and also how much power you hand over to them. Questions are the most commonly used interview tool, but we can utilize a range of other textual, visual, and creative tools because we want to engage our interviewees the most and also stimulate the discussion. You can stick with some short written text or comic strips, for example, where you will ask interviewees to read them at a particular point in the interview and ask them to comment on the situation at hand. Or you can show some photos and graphics, again, to draw out their tacit knowledge, some memories, and maybe even emotions. You just need to remember to adjust the tools to the particular topic of the research and also the persona you're going to interview. Depending whether you're talking to a child or maybe a professional, lawyer, or maybe a doctor, the language you're using and the examples you're using to highlight particular things will probably be different. Another thing that I find pretty much tricky about qualitative interviewing is the sampling issue. Theoretical sampling, as we call it, refers to the selection what is made on the basis of relevance for your theory. You don't necessarily start with your sample set in stone, but rather you modify it and seek further cases in the light of your ongoing analysis of data, and also depending on whether you are able to develop any theoretical ideas yet. Now, let's move on to the notion when or why qualitative interviews could be beneficial for you. We have a sense that Generally speaking, you want to conduct them if you want to collect detailed, rich qualitative data. In other words, when you want to understand of how and why individuals experience, perceive, form opinions, feel some emotions, or behave in a particular manner. In case of semi-structured and unstructured interviews, we deal with lots of flexibility, and we count on massive contribution on the part of our respondent in the form of a conversation. When you decide to go for it, you usually want to generate some insights, maybe expand understanding of social concepts. You may study sensitive topics, so you really need to see your interviewer face to face in order to pay attention to what is being said and also make the interviewer comfortable when talking about it. You may also look for some exceptions to general universal rules. What's important in here is to know that respondents are sharing information in their own words. This is where we encourage you to look for some stories. Stories are great because they represent and illustrate really important things, while respondents are usually at ease sharing them because storytelling comes naturally to many people as long as you as the interviewer is empathetic and when your body language is affirmative. You meet because you think that they have a story to tell. Make them feel that the story is really, really great and you really need to hear that. What works well for me are also active listening techniques. When you say, wow, tell me more about that. That is really interesting. It generally opens your respondent up and allows them to expand on a particular topic. Yet, when you are creating energy within the conversation, there is one major drawback. The notion that we are relying on the respondent's accuracy and intensity. We simply need to pay attention to it as well. So how can we prepare for conducting an interview?
There are a number of things that you need to do to prepare for conducting your interviews. Initially, you'll need to get ethical approval as part of the Holt research process, and this ensures that you've considered all the potential impact the interview participation might have on your research subjects or whoever you'll be interviewing. So details of the ethical principles from Holt can be found in the Holt Research Portal. And in order to gain ethical approval, you'll need to prepare a consent form, which can be attached to the ethics form on the research portal. So this consent form is a document for the eyes of the potential interviewees, which gives a description of the study. It also tells the interviews how you'd like them to participate and what kind of data you'll collect. For example, if you want to collect their views or experiences and opinions, and also how this data will be used. You'll need to inform them of their freedom to withdraw themselves or their data from the study at any time, as well as how you will maintain their confidentiality and anonymity. And this consent form would also be the place to mention any costs or incentives that the participant might incur as a result of being involved in the research. So once this has all been approved, you can begin to recruit your interviewees. And it's a good idea to recruit slightly more than you think you need, because often people might not be able to make it or they might drop out as the research goes along. Then you'll need to prep for the interviews themselves. So we would advise creating a topic guide, and this is something for you as the researcher to refer to during the interview, which helps guide the interview over the particular topics of interest. And it will have some suggested prompts for delving into particular areas that would really help to answer your research questions. The basis of the topic guide is the research question, but it's often also informed by a review of the existing literature in the area. So, for example, if you're interviewing someone about their experiences of learning and development, having reviewed the literature, you might realise that lots of the previous research has shown that learning can be enhanced when people's emotions are heightened. So you might want to ask participants about any incidents where they felt particularly under pressure or proud of something that they'd achieved and what the outcome of that situation was. And on this slide, you can see a little example of a topic guide that was used for some Holt research into different generations in the workplace. And as you can see, the guide is structured into key areas of interest, and there are some suggested questions to explore those areas. We would also really recommend doing a pilot interview. They can also be really helpful, so you can test the flow of the questions and see whether it kind of goes smoothly or not. And it also lets you know whether the questions that you have chosen actually elicits the responses that you need to answer your research question. So once you've done all this preparation, you might wonder how you actually conduct the interview. So there are some general rules to try and stick to when conducting the interview in order to get the best data that you can. So first of all, you'll need to create a space that's appropriate to the situation and the interviewee. So some interviews might need to be more formal, like the picture above there, and others might be better off in an informal setting, like the one below. So avoid closed questions like, so did you begin your career in marketing? Instead, use phrases like, so can you tell me about how you begun your career? Other good open questions to use are, could you describe a time where you felt X, or why do you think X? And as Kate mentioned, it's really good to ask these questions to help people feel open and honest in expressing themselves. Another key thing is to avoid leading their answers. So try to remain neutral when you can and avoid saying things like, oh, wow, you must have felt really X. Instead of saying that, just say, so how did that make you feel? And emotions are key to identifying areas that are of importance to the participants. And these can often be useful during analysis when you're trying to understand the motivations behind an individual's behaviour or perspective. So if an interviewee shows emotion about something, it can be a good idea to try and explore this further, provided you can tell that they are comfortable with that. And of course, you want the interview to flow really naturally and try to avoid any awkward silences, but also try to avoid the temptation to fill every silence. And I sometimes find that if you pause for a little longer than you usually would during a normal conversation, you often find that the participant actually elaborates or continues talking and shares more. In general, as Kate mentioned, try to maintain a relaxed atmosphere, and this is key to making the interviewee feel comfortable. And the key thing as well is to remember that at the end of the interview, try to end on a positive note so that they leave there feeling like they had a good experience. And overall, you want to have a conversation with the participants speaking roughly 80% of the time and practice active listening skills. Show interest in what participants are saying. And most of the time, fortunately, people really appreciate the chance to reflect on and share their experiences. So if you bear the points that we've mentioned in mind, you're on track for a great interview. And plus, the more practice you have, the more you'll develop your own unique personal interviewing style and feel more comfortable. So next we have some top tips for the interviewer.
Let us repeat a couple of questions and issues we have a sense are really vital for you to succeed as the interviewer. First of all, get to know your interviewee before you meet them. It is really vital for you to get some demographic and psychographic information because it will allow you to adjust the language of the interview according to the respondent. You want to build a bridge between them and the topic of the interview and also establish a good rapport with you. You may also consider using some humor as icebreaker if you find it appropriate to your respondent. Social skills are really essential. You need to stay empathic with the interviewee during the whole interview and try to make them comfortable. Have in mind that interviewing is about creating real connections. We will also like to advise you to get prepared to explain why you are collecting data and why the interviewee's input is really critical for the success of your project. This way, they will see a broader context for their role in the project. They will be better able to understand how important it is for you to get credible and authentic information. In case of some respondents, it may also lead to building greater confidence in them and build more willingness to share. Before the interview begins, remind your interlocutor of their confidentiality and anonymity. But it can be also useful to let them know that you are keen to explore particular research questions or areas, but you're not looking for a right or wrong answer for them. You want them to open up and express themselves, but without being judgmental. And last but not least, thank participants for being with you and also show appreciation for their contribution and time. This is them giving you additional intel. This is them giving you their time, usually for free. Let's move on to the tips that relate to the content of the interviewee. As Grace mentioned, simple, easy, short questions are a must. You want to be clear and leave no room for misinterpretation. You don't want to confuse your interlocutor, so don't ask more than one question at a time. Make them focus on one thing at a time. Don't be afraid to follow the course of the interview. Yes, you have the interview guides prepared and probably printed, but interview is a very dynamic relationship. So you may want to change the order of questions, omit some of them, or pursue some new leads. I think that you shall simply follow the respondent, but on the other hand, remember that you want to achieve the main goal of the interview and get some content, knowledge from the interlocutor. For us, the 7 whys method is working pretty much nicely. If you hear anything interesting, surprising, shocking, unexpected, go for it. Try to understand the underpinnings and motivations and reasons for the situation to evolve in a particular manner, but also try to understand the role of the respondent in it. Why do you say you like Krispy Kreme donuts? Why this particular brand? Why donuts in the first place and not cookies? Why there needs to be a pink frosting on the top to make you pick a particular donut? Why do you have a sense that they cheer you up? On top of that, try some following up and probing. Try to get the interviewee to elaborate their answers, like, could you say some more about that? What do you mean by that? How about asking even more direct questions, repeating the last point that the interviewer has said, and saying, oh yes, I see, right. You want to affirm the interviewee that what they are saying is really important and that you're paying attention to them. You also need to show that you are really curious. I think that your curiosity and following the respondents might be the key for the extraordinary interview. The next vital point is listening. Allow the interviewee to actually talk. Grace mentioned 80%. This is another key for you. What may be even more important, allow them to talk at their own pace. Don't rush them. Do not answer questions for them. Wait for the input. And also have in mind that they are reading your body language. Try to focus on them. Don't think of the next question while they are still talking, and show by nodding, maybe some gestures, hand gestures, that you are in the conversation with them. While listening, don't be afraid of silence. You can nicely use it to prod the respondent to reflect and even amplify the answer. We would also advise you to not exceed the allocated time for the interview. For us, it's a kind of sign of respect because you need to have in mind that the respondent is doing you a favor, and besides the interview, they may have other obligations too. And also, write up the interview as soon as you finish. Your memory is elusive, and you will not have a second chance. I think that even 15 minutes after interview shall be enough for you to reflect on the main points that came up, and also to write down some additional notes that you have a sense you need to follow up on your end. So what happens then?
So once you've conducted all of your interviews, you'll usually want to transcribe them. And at Holt, we have a number of approved suppliers that we can get in contact with if you need help pointing in the right direction for this. So once you've got all of your transcriptions, you'll need to begin your analysis. And the type of analysis you choose to do will be guided by your overall epistemology. And if you're planning to write an academic qualitative paper, you'll need to be really clear about your epistemological approach and how this informed your analysis. And there's some resources in the references slide of this webinar. So I will quickly just mention some possible ways that you can analyse interview data. The most common way to analyse it is using a thematic analysis. So this is used if you want to get an idea of the salient themes and sub-themes related to the research area. And this mainly focuses on the explicit content of what is said. And there are a number of different ways you can do a thematic analysis. You can use a grounded theory approach, for example, or a thematic network analysis. Grounded theory is an inductive approach whereby you let the data guide your inquiry rather than using a lens that you've predetermined to view the data through. And Corbin and Strauss offer a good step-by-step guide to coding and organising your qualitative data into themes. Narrative analysis is another method you can use, and this focuses on the stories that people tell, and it tries to gain an understanding of how participants create meaning in their lives. IPA is a type of analysis through which the researcher attempts to see through the eyes of the interviewee and to understand how they themselves make sense of the topic of interest. Whereas discourse analysis focuses more on the language that people use during interviews and how their words are structured and ordered to construct meaning. So on this slide are lots of useful resources for an introduction to start you off looking for some useful ways to analyse and conduct qualitative interviews. And we hope this has been a useful introduction to why and how you might conduct them. And thank you very much for listening, and feel free to contact either of us via email if you have any questions.
Thank you, and hopefully good luck.
Good luck.